Morning, everybody. I'm here because I want to discuss about extending the metaphorical framework we all use to discuss the consequences of technical decision making. Or perhaps it's an experiment in self-justification. My name is Sebastian, and I have a metric fuck ton of technical debt. I work for STREETEASY, which is a real estate search engine / portal based in New York City. And we started almost 8 years ago in 2005 when Rails was at 0.13.1. We now have, as of last count, 212 models, 209 controllers, almost 28,000 commits, and 10 developers working on that code. We've slowly grew from 3 developers 8 years ago to about 4 years ago to 10 developers right now. And as you can imagine, that means we've accumulated a lot of technical debt. So raise your hand if you have technical debt in your projects. Raise your hand if you're ashamed of the technical debt you have in your projects. So now, changing back to the real estate metaphor, which is what I'm trying to do. Raise your hand if you live with your parents. Raise your hand if you rent your apartment or home. Raise your hand if you bought your house. Of those of you who bought your house, are you ashamed of the size of your mortgage? That's good. So the concept of technical debt was basically a metaphor invented by Cunningham, who also happens to be the inventor of the idea of the wiki. On Sunday night, there was a speakers event at New Relic, where I got there early and I started chatting with some of their developers, and they asked me about my talk, and I say, it's going to be about technical debt. And there's this older guy who comes and says, oh, great, I invented the term of technical debt. It's like, yeah, I saw your name tag, I wasn't sure. And he started talking about a lot of things, about the metaphor, where it came from, and he told me, the only thing I could remember, he told me precisely the way he said it so I could quote him, is he loves to be quoted. But he said that the idea of technical debt started as in a discussion about a project for a financial company. He came up with the idea of explaining to them how some of the decisions they made, they will have to be revisited and they will have to go back and fix some things. And the term debt was a very good way to convey that to them. It started as a metaphor to communicate with non-technical people about the consequences of how you develop a project. Also, coincidentally, later on in that same event, I met with David Heinemeier Hansson. He makes the same question, what are you going to talk about? And I tell him about what War just told me. He said, so it was an extraction. He came up with an idea to discuss a problem, and then he turned that into a metaphor, and he ran with it. And that's kind of what I intend to do today. I want to take that metaphor and stretch it and see how far I can do it before it breaks. Because it's a metaphor that's also useful to discuss with peers about the decisions we're making. And lately, it's been used more and more in that regard. It's basically the idea that I gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. It's deferring over time the costs of a decision while getting the benefits today. Looking over the web and reading about documents, the best definition I've found is code in which a reasonable engineer in the present wishes was different. Is somebody who now wants to change it. That's technical debt. And it has a lot to do with the idea of a tree falling in the forest and someone being there to hear it fall or not. Technical debt needs an engineer wishing it was different. If no one wishes it's different, then there's no technical debt. If it works, don't fix it. Technical debt is debt paid with time. You have to go back and work on things you didn't want to pay up front. But the interests are paid with pain. There's no debt if there's no pain. If it doesn't bother anyone, then it's okay. There's no debt. You're not paying. It's like getting a credit card with 0% APR. It's a great tool to manage your finances as long as it's 0% APR. The moment they start ramping up your interest, you should go back and pay it. And it's kind of what we tend to call at STREETEASY pain-driven development. When something hurts, by all means, go and fix it. But if it doesn't, let it be. If we're going to talk about the different types of technical debt, I like to use this quadrant of the unexpected and the planned, and the tactical and the strategic. When we talk about unexpected, it's that suddenly becomes painful because things have changed. Your company pivoted. You didn't expect that pivot when you made the original decision, but now things have changed. Your context is different. You have to go back and change things so that they now adapt to the present. You were not expecting that when you made the original decision. You can plan for it. You can be proactive and use good design that's easy to change afterwards. You can prepare for refactoring early on. But until things change, you don't know what's going to happen and what's going to be the new change. There's also the unexpected, I call it strategical, that you changed. You now know better. You've learned new techniques. You now look at the code and say, that was stupid. I should not have written it that way. But back then, I didn't know it was stupid. It was my best effort at the time. And it's a great thing that we've progressed and we've learned enough to now be able to suffer those consequences. You are a better person now. Go back and fix your bad mistakes from the past. Then there's the planned technical debt. The idea that later is cheaper, that we don't have the time right now to do 100% test code coverage because we need to get this code out of the door right now. The cost of delaying it in time is too high versus the benefits of getting it better right now. It'll be cheaper to do it later. Later, our time will have a lesser cost. Later, we'll have time. Hopefully, shipping it today will permit the company to be alive later when we can fix it. And there's the planned strategic. Later is better, not just cheaper, but later you know better. The idea of deferring a decision as far as you can because you will have more information. You will be able to make a better decision later on. It's the idea of, it's betting on Yakni. You are not going to need it. You defer the feature until somebody really needs it. And we, as developers, we are very good at not following that advice. We want to build things. And we want to build them right. We are proud of our work. We want it to look pretty. We want it to look perfect. We want tests to be there. We want to do test-driven development. But the reality of the world is that it's not always possible to do so. And delaying that until later, it's usually a better decision than getting it right. It's the idea that good enough is better than perfect. And if we go back to the metaphor of real estate, the idea of the unexpected tactical debt, the things change around you, it's debt that can have very high cost. If things change suddenly, you might find yourself paying 80% interest on a paycheck loan just so you could cover those medical costs that came out of nowhere. It's kind of like a loan shark. The idea of the strategical technical debt is closer to a credit card. You tend to have a more manageable interest rate. You can cover the payments as long as you don't accumulate too much. You want to keep it under control. You want to use it for short changes, and you don't want to use it as your main tool for managing your finances. Then you have the rental lease. You have to live somewhere, and that's kind of what happens with developers too. We need to ship features. Because otherwise we don't get paid. That's what pays our salary. Pretty code doesn't pay your salary. Features do. The idea of having a rental lease, a short-term, when you sign a lease, you're basically committing to paying a couple $1,000s every month for the next year. You are creating debt. It's debt with low interest or no interest, but the idea that you will have to come up with that much money every month, it's there. You will have to keep paying it over time. And it's usually a very good decision if you're talking about short-term living. You should not pay your rent using your credit card. And you should not pay your rent using a payday loan. And then you have the home mortgage, the long-term planning, the idea that you can put some money right now, get a large house, and pay a bit by bit every month. And also the expectation that 5 years from now, those mortgage payments are going to be very much less impactful on your finances than they are right now. You try to stretch as much as you can afford, but as time passes by, you get a raise, you get a better living. That's what you're hoping for. That's the bet you're making. Because debt is leverage. You're taking the little bit of money you have right now, or the little bit of time you have right now, you try to make as much as you can from it by betting on someone. That is a trade-off. You're trading off something good enough right now versus and later payments versus something that you might not be able to afford right now. If you have $1 million in cash in the bank, then buying property with it, it's a good idea. But not everybody does have $1 million in the bank. And if you have $1 million in the bank, you can probably get a loan for a house with that, paying half the house and getting very low interest payments. You still can use debt as a leverage to take as much advantage as possible from the resources you have right now. And debt is a bet. It's a bet that the future is going to be better than the present for paying those costs. If it's not so, if you believe that it's going to be bad for you in the future, don't get in debt. Don't buy a house if you think you're going to lose your job right now, because you're going to lose the down payment you put on the house too, not just and you're going to lose the house. But it's a bet that things are going to be better, that you will be able to pay it off later, and it's going to be less painful than paying it off right now. And we reached the point where that I really want to make in this talk is that technical debt is a good sign. If you don't have technical debt, you're probably overpaying up front. If you don't have technical debt, you are building things that are better than necessary. Or even worse, you're building things that you think are better than necessary, but the future will prove you wrong. You're doing things, it's like people being happy when they get a refund at tax time. You overpaid. You lend money to the federal government at a 0% interest rate. You could have used that money instead of getting a refund a year later. The ideal is to have to pay $100. You paid exactly the amount of taxes you owed, and you saved for yourself $100 you could use for other things in the meantime. Technical debt is a great thing to have as long as it's manageable. It also means being able to track how much technical debt you have. How much debt is good? It's a good amount of debt to have. Well, it depends on a lot of things. It's kind of like when you need to live somewhere, should you rent or should you buy? And there are plenty of rent versus buy calculators. They're all based around the idea of interest rates, of investment returns, of things like closing costs. But one of the most significant factors is length of ownership. If you're going to live somewhere for 3 years, you're always better off renting than buying. If you're going to live somewhere for 7 years, you're almost always going to be better buying than renting. The length of the loan matters a lot. And the things that you never expect, like closing costs, make that difference more obvious once you write it down. So are you a tenant or are you an owner in your project? Things like, what's the project lifetime? Is your project, are you a consultant working on a 6-month engagement for somebody else? And also with a team that every 6 months changes, with new developers, where you have to train people. Because one of the largest sources of pain and thus largest sources of technical debt is new hires. When somebody comes into a code base they don't understand, it is going to be painful. So if you follow best practices, if you don't deviate from the norms of Rails, if you use exactly the by-the-book patterns, it's going to be easier to explain to new hires how the project works, how the code base is established. But you're not going to get the benefits that you get sometimes by breaking those patterns, by creating your own variation on a framework that might make sense if you're working on a long-term project. At STREETEASY, every time there's a new employee, we go through the same routine of finding pain points. And I tell the new hires, like, go ahead and fix it. If you think it's worth your time right now, fix it, because you are the one feeling the pain. I don't feel it right now. That part, I understand, it works for me, but if you think it's broken, go ahead and fix it. There is pain, thus there's debt, and it might be worth fixing it. It has a lot to do, too, with debt liquidity. How easy is it to pay your debt? And if you are writing the software that's going to launch a rocket to the moon, and you find yourself, you discover a pain point in the code that you decide you want to fix, but the rocket is in the middle of the trip, then you can't fix it. Then you better pay that up front. You can't accumulate that debt. But if you're working on a web app that can be deployed 5 times a day, then technical debt is easy to accumulate. It's like as soon as you feel a little bit of pain, you can go and fix it and ship it. As soon as you feel a lot of pain in some areas, you can spend some time fixing it and deploying it. How easy is it to pay your debt has a lot to do with how much you can accumulate. And remember that there is a lot of debt that's surprise, that you were not expecting, that things change. So writing good code is creating potential debt if the context changes. So you should prepare for that too. How easy is it going to be to pay debt in this section of the code if it suddenly shows up because the context changed? And that's where good design comes from. But again, you don't need to overdo the good design. You just need to prepare. You need to make sure you're not closing doors by picking the wrong architecture, but you don't need to solve every single problem beforehand either. There's also the idea of the debt schedule. How long are you going to pay? Are you getting a 15-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage? Are you getting a fixed APR or a variable APR? How often you need to pay? If you need to pay every month, then a little bit of interest, like with a credit card, you can accumulate some debt, but not that much. You don't want to get $500,000 in debt on a credit card that charges you 20% APR and you have to pay every month the minimum balance. But if you get on a 30-year lease, on a 30-year mortgage for a house, and whatever you're paying every month is something you can afford, then it's fine. Sometimes technical debt you don't have to pay it. And that's one of the main differences with real estate, is that you can go, it's more like a credit card, a 0% APR, where you manage to get a new card every year and transfer the balance, and you can accumulate it. And a lot of people have taken advantage of those offers. You can have a lot of 0% APR debt. You can accumulate a lot of technical debt that's not painful. And I bet you that most of you, the technical debt you have is not charging you interest. You're not suffering from it right now. You might at some point, but you're not yet. It's like, what do you do when you have a house? Should you paint a wall, redo the kitchen, or build a pool? Well, it depends. It depends on whether you own or rent. It depends on whether you expect to live there for 7 years or 15 years or 1 year. It depends on the value you think it'll bring to the property. Building a pool in a rental house, it's a stupid idea. But building a pool in a house you expect to live for 15 years, it'll be great because you'll be able to use the pool, enjoy it, and it might increase the value of the house. Go ahead and do it. Get in debt. Get a loan to do it. It might make sense. Paying it cash if you're renting, it's a stupid thing. Same thing, if you're renting, you might want to paint a wall a different color. You know you will have to paint it back to white before returning the apartment, or they'll keep your security deposit. But you can plan for it. You can say, okay, the happiness I get from painting this wall blue is worth having to paint it back to white later. Thinking in terms of time frames and cost benefit and the size of the interest payment you will have, the pain you will have to pay later, is the best way to think about whether accumulating debt is worth it or not. And then we get to the subject of refinancing, which is what often happens when you have a large part of your project that becomes more and more painful. You go and you spend a month fixing it. You don't go and rebuild the entire application. You don't go into bankruptcy, where you basically rewrite everything. You give up. You say, the amount of pain this is generating is it overwhelms the value of the entire application. We're better off rebuilding it from scratch. But most of the time, you're fine just refinancing. Just discussing with a bank that will give you some money under different interest terms, so that now you can afford to pay the interest, but you've solved the problem you had. You lowered your pain levels. Again, most of the time, you're better off just lowering the pain level rather than getting rid of it altogether. because the future will be different, because getting rid of it altogether will not make it better, because down the road it will still be painful because the context will change. Accumulating that, it's not a bad idea, as long as you can manage it and it's not painful enough that forces you to go bankrupt. But bankruptcy, it's always an option. And as developers, we love to start projects from scratch, so we tend to think about bankruptcy as the perfect option, especially when we land into a new job and no one else is there to stop us. Really try hard against it, because if you join a company that has a product that's working, there's a reason why it's working. It might be ugly code, it might be hard to maintain, but it's been working for a while. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to pay your salary. Well, there might be startup financing laws that distort reality there, but you're working on something that has been working for a while, that it's not as ugly as you think it is. Think very, very hard before you go bankrupt, just like you do in the real world. It might be the best way to solve your problems at some point if you're in such a bad shape, but most of the time you're better off trying to repay, try to refinance, try to renegotiate your mortgages. Because debt is a tool. Use it wisely, and remember, if you have no debt, you're overpaying. That is a good signal that you're doing things right, as long as it doesn't become painful enough that you want to go bankrupt. So, questions? Good. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.